welcome on a dreary day. Very, very well put. Good mental image there. And even on a dreary day, the light of Christ is shining. It's good to sing His praises. Always love being together as family. Wanted to quickly mention, because I had just got a note this morning, the Becks are not feeling well, so that's where they're at. If you want to think about them, I know Maggie was not feeling well. It's just kind of going to be that cold and flu season, and I think we all appreciate when people are going to keep that to themselves and let us pray for you and then come back when you're fully well. And so we'll be thinking about all of them. I was asked if I had seen Karina before, and I had not, and now I do. And so that's making my whole day. I'm really excited to see you. Glad you're here. What else was there? I was thinking about cold and flu season, and I had a moment of, it was a memory and just kind of a little bit of compassion for those young parents with very little ones. I saw one just sneeze right in Brian's face, and I thought, there's a moment when that's just as cute as can be, and then it's weird, that age of, no, you can't do that anymore. We've got to fix that. So that was cute. And good luck, Brian. God gives parents extra immunity, I think, is what happens there. All right, this is what we're going to do this morning. I've titled this an idol chat. You just got to spell it right. It's IDOL. We're going to talk about idols, which, again, hey, what greater thing to talk about? I know even the mention of idol or idolatry, if you're like me and you grew up in Bible studies, you picture an ancient people, very superstitious, bowing down to carved images that they happen to believe will do something for them, and even when they don't, they just believe all the more. And if that's the picture you have in mind, if you're asked, how's idolatry doing in our world, you might think it's pretty much disappeared in our modern world. But that's not really all idolatry is. And so I want to discuss that with you in a series going forward. And today will just be the idol chat that leads up to the rest of the series. And so here's what I want to do. I want to start with the concept that there is a sense in which there's not a lot of harm in passing off the fake for the real. We do this all the time. We know that jewelry, and some people like to wear jewelry, can be very expensive the more real it is, and so we wear what we call costume jewelry. That's fine. That's okay. It's saving some money. It's a good thing to do. Perhaps you've all heard of knockoffs, which are not the real expensive brand, but one that looks like it, and there's some funny knockoffs. I think of soda, the first thing that comes to mind, and anybody, and I know I've got a lot of Texans in here, that hears Dr. Pepper being passed off as Mr. Pibb, you're almost offended immediately, right? And there's lots of knockoffs like that, but there's nothing wrong in that per se. Maybe you found a pair of really nice glasses that aren't the name brand, but they look like them, or designer jeans that are knocked off, or a purse or bag, right? So we all say kudos if you found that. Now, while there's some innocence in that, there is a moral line you can cross when it comes to passing off the fake for real. And probably one of the first ones that comes to mind would be counterfeit money. Nobody should be passing off what is the fake as real when it comes to money. You get into a lot of trouble, cause a lot of damage in doing something like that. What about those who've had their identities stolen? Someone else using your credit cards, usually is the way that goes, or information to get what they want is a horrible thing to do. Even fake IDs being passed off as real could get you into a lot of trouble. But what I want to say throughout this series is that perhaps the most damage is done in passing the fake as a real comes from people who believe in fake gods. And that's the idea here. Now again, idol worship is doing real well in our world. And maybe to understand that, it's time to reshape or redefine how we would view it. And so I got a couple quotes up here that I thought would help out. And Ed Stetzer's is an article, actually, Idolatry is Alive Today. He says, isn't that a 12-inch tall piece of wood or bronze can do something bad to us? Or is it that we do something awful to ourselves when we place adoration and attention that should go to God and other things? When it comes to idolatry, the danger is not in the item, it is in us. And so we see perception maybe widening our view of what idolatry is. Tim Keller, in his book, Counterfeit Gods, speaks to the same thing. He says, an idol is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, and anything that you seek to give you what only God can give. And so you're getting a broadening sense, I hope now, of what idolatry really is. I'll take you to the Bible for some backdrop. When God saves Israel from Egypt, He performs many miracles in the land, miracles in their escape. And when He finally gets them free, He takes them up to a mountain. And on purpose, He has their full attention. And from there, He gives what we would often call the 10 Commandments. And I would just say this about the 10 Commandments. They fall under a lot of scrutiny to those who are not believers in God, because what they think is that religion is just another way to control you. And so these commands are God's ways of restraining His people and restricting His people. And I got to put it into your mind that that is not at all what God was about when He took the people who He freed to the mountain. Because He begins the conversation like this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, where you were slaves. God reminds them He brought them out of slavery, and it was not His intent in giving direction for life to have them bound again to that which had held them. You see, God, from the beginning, is a God of real freedom. And I'll go on in the account, starting at verse 3. Worship no God but me. Do not make for yourselves images of anything in heaven or on earth or in the water under the earth. Do not bow down to any idol or worship it, because I am the Lord your God, and I tolerate no rivals. You see, God never intended His commandments to be restraints in the sense of slavery to His people. They were meant to break the restraints that had bound them while they had been in Egypt, away from God. And the one rule in all of this list that I think would safeguard us the best against our natural propensity towards bondage is the first one: worship no God but me. Do you know, if we could live our life by that one guideline, it would naturally make all the others line up. I mean, it says it all. And I would point this out, that false gods or fake gods exist because there's a true God in which to compare themselves to. You see, they're the counterfeit of something that is real. And so God saying no other gods is not God admitting, oh yeah, no, there's a bunch of gods out there, and I'm one of. That's not what He's saying at all. What God is saying is He knows the hearts of men, and He knows the people that He has made, and that idle minds will want a God that fits them in their own minds. And that's what's being talked about here. In fact, there's a great conversation in Isaiah chapter 44. And I'll read verses 6 through 9 here in a second. You could read the whole chapter. There's so much said here about the foolishness of carving something and calling it a god. But here's a part of that conversation. The Lord, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord of heavenly forces, says, I am the first and I am the last, and besides me there are no gods. Who is like me? Let them speak up, explain it, and lay it out for me. Who announced long ago what is to be? Let them tell us what is to come. Don't tremble. Have no fear. Didn't I proclaim it? Didn't I inform you long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? There is no other rock. I know of none. Idol makers are all as nothing. Their playthings do no good. Their promoters neither see nor know anything. They ought to be ashamed. Now, that is not God acknowledging that other gods actually exist, rather an acknowledgement that every human will at some point willingly surrender their heart to something. And here's what that means. If my heart is not fully surrendered and devoted to God, I will fill it with something else. In fact, I think John Calvin was nails on when he said the human heart is an idol factory. Just constantly thinking of where our devotion lies, where our attention should be. You see, we're taught repeatedly in the Bible, avoid idolatry, avoid idolatry. It's mentioned nonstop as the biggest deal, the big sin. We should know all about this. And if we could understand that one commandment, have no other gods, I'm telling you, it's going to help us figure out the whole rest of what God is trying to tell us. You know, more than 1,000 times in Scripture, we're told not to have any other gods or idols. And that's not just an Old Testament idea. John, as he's writing to the New Testament church, says, little children, guard yourselves from idols. And after a whole book on love, have you ever finished that and thought, well, where's that coming from? That's left field. No, John's getting the point, and that's what I want to do right now in our first section here. I want to say, what is it that we're actually guarding ourselves from? So what is an idol? Well, as I mentioned, an idol is not just a little carved piece of wood or carved stone. Those are just images that help capture the principle of idolatry. Idols, in a sense, are people, places, or things, or ideas that we start to put all of our focus on. It is the opportunity to take a created thing and treat it as though it were the Creator itself. It becomes our everything. In a real sense, it's moral inflation. It's putting way more value on something than its natural worth. Effectively, it's seeing the thing, the object, as a functional savior. And I will tell you, that is the beginning of all sin. And we know that because we can go all the way back to the beginning in the Garden of Eden, and that's how Satan tempts Adam and Eve. He tempts them with the idea that, you got a good thing going here, but there's some restrictions. And if you could replace God, you could have everything you want. In fact, Paul describes this idea as the reason for the corruption of all mankind in Romans chapter 1. He said they knew God, that is mankind. They knew God, but they did not give glory to God or thank Him. Their thinking became useless. Their foolish minds were filled with darkness. I just wanted to note there that this all starts with a misplaced glory. And I'll come back to that glory in a moment. But going on in verse 25, Paul says, they traded the truth of God for a lie. They worshiped and served what had been created instead of the God who created those things, who should be praised forever. Amen. Now, we are so intelligent as a people. We are so enlightened, we like to believe that when we think of idolatry, we just say in our minds, well, what Paul's talking about there is an ancient, uneducated, superstitious people. But that's not the fairest assessment of idolatry as a whole. Paul once entered a city that was known for its intelligence and its great civilization. It was Athens. Now you just think about that moment. He walked into the most educated city of its time, the home of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. No city in the world was considered more civilized, sophisticated, or educated than Athens. And yet, what do we know about that city? He found more gods in that city than any city he ever walked in before. I mean, they had one god they didn't even know what to call yet. And I want to suggest today that idolatry actually appeals to enlightened people. See, to everyone who is easily impressed with themselves, idolatry is selling you the illusion that you can replace God for whatever your heart desires and still be in control. That's the picture here. You see, idolatry turns the object we want into our ultimate objective. You see, idols are just desires we elevate, and we won't negotiate with it anymore. You know how you got an idol? Someone will suggest you're spending a little too much time here, or you're putting too much emphasis here, and no. You refuse to let that go. Now, it could be an image of stone. It could be images you watch on your computer or TV. It's an expression of the principle. You have elevated a desire and you are unwilling to center your life around literally anything else. And that's how you know idolatry still is around. Now, listen, that desire we cling to might actually begin as a good thing. And this happens all the time. This is the folly of idolatry. But although it's a good thing, it was never intended to be our everything. And here's how we ought to see this developing. You see, every other commandment that God gives in His list of commandments is an expression of the first. Have no other God. Think this through. It's why we have the fourth commandment, that the people should Sabbath rest. Why? Because God understood. They would take the gift of work and they would idolize that. It would become everything to them. It would be their identity, and there would be no rest. And so He's guarding against that. I heard somebody recently say, and was convicted by this, when we as people keep schedules that are unmanageable, then sickness becomes our Sabbath. And I just want to point out that maybe it's not business only. Maybe it's busyness that has become our God. Having a full schedule, having much to do, looking how important we must be in all of this can easily be our God. And God knows we can take a good thing and orient our lives around it and do a lot of harm to ourselves and to others. And then there's the sixth commandment, not to commit adultery. This is not the Bible saying that it doesn't want to talk about sex and that it's prohibited in all ways. That's not it at all. It's saying there's a place for this, a design for this. It shows us the God-given arrangement for this. And why? Because God knows sex makes a horrible God. And our country shows the fruit of that. You see, if you orient your life around that, it will hurt you and it will hurt others. And we're told, do not covet and do not steal. These aren't commandments against having nice things. God made the world to be enjoyed, and He made us to enjoy the things that He created. But if having things becomes my all, if I center my life around that, I will hurt myself and I will hurt others. And ultimately, that is what idolatry is. Idols take shape when I cling to a desire and I say, I'm not negotiating this. I'm holding on to this. And then that desire, that idol, becomes what I try to center or build my life around. Now, I know your first question is, why would I do that? Why would anybody do that? Well, here's why. Because our idols insist that they can meet our soul's deepest desires. And I'll just say this to any discontented person now: beware, idols are lurking. It's not evil to have desires. It's not evil to have wants. I believe our souls were created with desires in them. We were created to have a desire to work and feel a sense of purpose. Desire was put into us for relationship and ultimately real intimacy. And we have a desire to be satisfied by the food that we eat or to enjoy creation. And all of those God put into mankind before any sin entered into the world. But the one great lie, going all the way back to Eden, is that somehow God is constantly getting in the way of what I really, really want. Satan peddled that lie to Adam, and I'll tell you, he's whispering it to you, and it is actually what he tried to sell Jesus. After 40 days of fasting in the wilderness, we say that line so much, have you even just considered after 40 days of fasting? I would imagine most of your New Year's resolutions are gone now. 40 days. What does Satan say? Turn that stone into bread, which Jesus fully had the power to do. Now, there's nothing evil in bread. I want to be very clear about that. There's nothing wrong with bread. But this was the temptation. Jesus, you can have whatever you want, and you don't need God to have it. Outside of God, you can have whatever you want. And this is the lie of idolatry. You do not need God. You do not need fellowship with God to have the life you truly desire. And idols promise to deliver us that, but only God can really give it. And so this is ultimately the problem with idols. Every idol, no matter what it is, will eventually come tumbling down. Life, just the way life works, ultimately will knock down that idol that you serve, and you will get hurt, and it will hurt others. I've got a lengthy quote here, again from Tim Keller. I just like the way he talked about this in The Reason for God. And hang in there. Here's what he says. He says, here's what happens. If you center your life around your husband or your wife, you'll be emotionally dependent, jealous, and controlling. The other person's problems will be overwhelming to you. If you center your life and identity around your family and children, you'll try to live your life through your children until they resent you or have no self of their own. At worst, you may abuse them when they displease you. If you center your life and identity around work and your career, you'll be a driven workaholic and a boring, shallow person. At worst, you'll lose family and friends, and if your career goes poorly, develop deep depression. If you center your life on money or possessions, you'll be eaten up by worry or jealousy about money. You'll be willing to do unethical things to maintain your lifestyle, which eventually will blow up your life. If you center your life on pleasure, gratification, and comfort, you'll find yourself addicted to something. You'll be chained to escape strategies by which you avoid the hardness of life. And if you center your life and identity on relationships and approval, you'll be constantly hurt by criticism and thus always losing friends. And you will fear confronting others and therefore a useless friend. If you center your life and identity on a noble cause, you'll divide the world into good and bad and demonize your opponents. Ironically, you'll be controlled by your enemies because without them you have no purpose. And if you center your life on religion and morality, you will, if you are living up to your moral standards, be proud and self-righteous. And if you're not living up to your standards, your guilt will be utterly devastating. Now, I think that is a great commentary on what Paul says in Romans chapter 1. Remember, repeatedly he's saying, God gave them over. God gave them over. And then in verse 8, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth through their wickedness. Now, here's something that might be shocking to you. Contrary to the kind of preaching you might hear on TV, God does not reveal his wrath through suicide bombers, church shooters, extreme weather, and other tragedies. God's wrath is ultimately revealed from heaven by allowing you to chase your idols. And that's what Paul's talking about here. In fact, he goes on to say, and I think this couldn't be more clear in the message, since they didn't bother to acknowledge God, God quit bothering them and he let them run loose, and then all hell broke loose. And when idols become our way of life and God gets terminated, this is what it looks like. And for me, always been a fan of Gollum, this is exactly what Tolkien was doing. His little character here, if you don't know the whole story, he actually started out a normal-looking man. Normal. Humanish. And he finds this ring, right? And the ring becomes his obsession. It's all he wants. To the betrayal and harm of a friend, it's his life's long obsession. Nothing matters. He doesn't take care of himself. All he wants is this precious, his ring. And notice what happens to him over time. He becomes grotesque. He becomes pathetic. He becomes creature-like, less than human. And what an illustration of the wrath of God. And ultimately, I think Tolkien does a great job impressing us with the idea that the ultimate tragedy is not just the harm we do to ourselves and to others. It's all the wasted years where it was everything and it filled you with nothing. All the empty years spent on something that could never fill your soul. And so the Bible warns us, you need to destroy your idols, or the day is coming soon when your idols will destroy you. You know, idols keep luring us until they finally get that seat in our heart where only God and his glory belong. And again, that's the way Paul words it in Romans 1, verse 22. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. We have exchanged the glory of God for fake gods. The word for glory used here is a word that means weight or heaviness. And so what Paul is saying is that ultimately, Christian, God ought to be the heaviest thing in your life, the one that holds the most weight, the one that fills you with the absolute purpose, the substance of your being. But the human heart is an idol factory. And in time, we pick up something that when push comes to shove, directs the course of our life that isn't God. And so we must figure out what is that heaviness in our life that doesn't belong there and exchange it back for the glory of God. You know, this is an age-old problem, and Israel's greatest general not only had military strategies in mind, he had an idol strategy that I want to share with you. And it's a passage you know well in Joshua 24. In addressing the people before he was no longer their leader, Joshua says, "Now respect the Lord and serve him fully and sincerely. Throw away the gods of your ancestors on the other side of the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. But if you don't want to serve the Lord, you must choose for yourselves today whom you will serve.
You may serve the gods of the ancestors, your ancestors' worship when they lived on the other side of the Euphrates River. Or you may serve the gods of the Amorites who lived in this land. But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And I know that's a familiar text, but did you know that this is an idol strategy? It's two-pronged. And the first is this: choose God. In fact, if you're paying close attention, choose God when? Every single day we choose God, and we choose God. Why is that so important? Because every single day, fakes, phonies, counterfeits are being thrown our way for allegiance from our heart. And we have to battle every day for what's going to carry the weight in our lives. The second part of this attack is we need to name the idol that's in competition for God's place in our heart. Now notice, Joshua actually named the idols that were vying for the heart of Israel of his day. And so what I believe is we need to identify in our day, what are those idols that are vying for that attention in our heart, in that place for God's glory? Now, I will say this isn't always easy, because as people were really, really, really good at deceiving ourselves. Anybody ever said, I don't have a problem with that? Yeah, we're good at this, and so be very careful. I want to maybe get this started in your minds as we start this series with a couple of questions that will help you out. How do you know something has too much weight in your heart? How do you know it's carrying too much heaviness in your life? Well, what are your dreams filled with? I am reminded of Tangled. This is the way my mind works too, Brian. And the hero of that movie just can't wait to get the crown and the money and the jewels. And even the burglars around him say, your dream stinks. The truth is, we may have our minds and our hearts focused on things that don't need to be there. And so what are your dreams about? What do you want? When your mind begins to drift, where does it end up landing? That'll tell you something about your heart. What do you fret over? Where do your worries, your anxiety, or your concern come from? And by the way, concern is just a great way of belittling worry and anxiety. So it's all in that category. Where is your heart focused? What do you sacrifice your time and your money for? Whose approval do you seek the most? What brings you joy? Well, that gets your mind turning a little bit, and that's what I want to do as we continue down this study, is I want to look at in this series and name those idols in our culture that are coming to the front. And it's not Baal, and it's not Dagon, and it's not Moloch. In fact, I want to talk about a God I think is doing really good in our world, and that's control. The perception of control. And it's not good for us to worship that God. We're going to talk about a God called me, and I was thinking before I got up here, not me, like me applies to me, but you do your me, right? Individual. Should maybe put I, now that I think about that. The God that is yourself is a huge God in our world. There's a God called work and one named success. I even want to talk about a God that I think is doing really well in our day called appearance and how you present yourself. And next week, we're going to start all this off by talking about an idol I think has won a lot of hearts in our culture. It's the God called more. But before I can dive into any of that, before we can start naming and exposing these false gods, I got something that I want you to think about. Now, we're told to guard ourselves from idols that carry too much weight in our lives. I want you alongside that to guard yourself from a temptation. Because here's what's going to happen, and maybe already you've pinpointed on one. You're honest people, and you're going to hear these lessons, and you're going to think, that's right. That's carrying too much weight in my life. I need to get rid of it. And the temptation you're going to go through is going to look like this. You're going to say, I feel really bad about this. What I need is just to squeeze a little more Jesus next to that. And that is not the solution to idolatry, okay? So if you start to see where that's at, it's the elimination of that idol that we're looking for. More Jesus next to all the idols we have is not the answer. In fact, I want to spare you from that temptation to greatly disgrace God, who says you can't have two masters. You can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of the one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. And whatever your God is, it's got to come off the shelf for the one true God. Because God does not want to be a God on the shelf of your heart. God wants you to recognize that He is the only glory that matters. He's the only heavy or weight or substance in our life. And I wanted to point that out because I think sometimes what religion can become is kind of a way for us to learn how to cope with life. When what pure and undefiled religion is all about is finding a way to center our lives around Jesus entirely. He's everything. And everything else, every distraction, every idol has to go to be fully focused on Him. Because God's not in the practice of blessing lives that include Him, but don't exalt Him. So, here's something I would just kind of warn you about as we get ready to get into this series, is that God's going to resist every attempt you make to keep your idols on that shelf. As long as we hold on to what are functional saviors, idols, we're going to have this distant relationship with God. And I find this interesting, because if I've heard one phrase more than any other in the last 25 years, it's Christians who've come to me and said, God just feels distant. He's not doing His job. He's not filling my heart. It's not as exciting as it used to be. And I look at all this and I think, is He? Is He distant? Maybe you're holding on to something that He won't tolerate. And as long as you hold on to those thoughts, ideas, people, places, or things, those functional saviors will always keep God at a distance from your heart. So God said to Ezekiel, as some of the elders of Israel had come out to him and sat down in front of him, then the Lord spoke these words to me, saying, "Human, these people want to worship idols. They put up evil things that cause people to sin. Should I allow them to ask me for help?" Do you hear what God is saying? You want to come and talk to me. You want to ask me to fix and rearrange your life and make it everything you've dreamed of. You want to tell me how distant I've been, how hard of hearing I must be, how short my arms are from heaven. How about we talk about the idols in your hands first? Anytime we try to draw near to God with hands clenched around idols, like a good father, the first thing God's going to say is, "Hey, let me see what's in your hands." Because you're not getting anywhere with God until you put down your idols. Because ultimately, and this is a tough concept, but ultimately God is too jealous for your heart to allow your pretend gods to succeed. And so let's get real about these pretend gods in our lives. Going back to Exodus 20, remember, you must not worship or serve any idol, because I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And Moses doesn't just slip that in there about the character of God. He repeats it, Exodus 34. Don't worship any other God, because I, the Lord, the jealous one, that's the name of God, am a jealous God. You see, God is simply unwilling to share your heart with any other desire. And I think that's really the painful message of Hosea's book. And we've all connected to that at some level. God's bride, whom He redeemed and washed and made pure. God's bride, whom He loved and gave everything He had to, had invited other lovers into their marriage. Now, the reasoning was, you can still be first, just want more. Every one of us connects with how horrible that is. In fact, the more isn't really the issue. 1 or 100, it's the addition that matters. It's substituting the truth of absolute fidelity and love that God gave, that Israel was trading in on. And we all understand this. We are jealous for that which has our whole heart. And I want to point out, as you read verses like this, God's jealousy for your heart is not a moral flaw. It only shows the trueness of His affection for you, and He knows, as Creator, what's good for you. And so again, in a different wording, you must worship no other gods, but only Jehovah, for He is a God who claims absolute loyalty and exclusive devotion. And so here's your warning. God will not sit idly by while you ruin your life with idols. And so expect Him to intercede. Expect Him to interrupt and intercept. You know how many times in my life things have been taking too much priority and too much focus, and then something goes wrong and you turn to God. And what's God going to say? What's that in your hand? Let's take a look about what matters to you and where the weight is and where the glory is at, because a good father always wants what's best for his children. And God knows. These idols we carry around are destroying us. And so he wants us to destroy these idols. And so this is the point. Don't want you to make room on the shelf of your heart for a little more God. It's time to do inventory and clear it out, so that there's room only for the only true God, so that there's room only for the one King that reigns, so that there's room only for the ruler of the universe and your life, for the only one that truly saves. And that's God's plan for you. And so next week, we're going to confront more together. And I hope throughout you'll be challenged to make more and more of God and less of self. If you're here and you're not a Christian this morning, you have the opportunity to put on Christ in baptism today. What an incredible opportunity that is. To confess to God, I've fallen short, I've had other gods, and I reject them. You alone are God. And to be buried with Jesus, what's submission, what's surrender to his will and his way. If you're ready for that, let us know. If you're here and you need our prayers, again, prayer is a wonderful way to say, I've been talking and thinking too much of those things that do not matter. God, let us talk to you and help arrange our life around Jesus Christ. He is the center of it all.